Greetings from the freezing cold Pine Barrens of southern New Jersey. Welcome to Far Out Radio with Scott Teeters. I'm Scott, and tonight we're going out on the skinny branches. Our guest is Tim Schwartz. Tim is a very accomplished man. He's an author, researcher, an Emmy Award-winning television producer and videographer, and a photojournalist. Tim's books include The Lost Journals of Nikola Tesla, The Secret Black Projects, Evil Agenda of the Secret Government, Time Travel, a How-To Guide, Richard Shaver and the Reality of the Inner Earth, Admiral Byrd's Secret Journey Beyond the Poles, and Tim has been a contributing writer for the books Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the First Ghostbuster, as well as Brad Steiger's Real Monsters, Gruesome Critters, and Beasts from the Dark Side. Tim has blended his interest in photography and travel with his interest in the paranormal phenomenon by visiting such diverse places as the Great Wall of China and the Great Pyramid in Egypt. He's worked for PBS, NBC, CBS, CNN, ESPN, Thames TV, and the BBC. Obviously, he's a very busy man, and we appreciate his time this evening. Tim, are you there? Welcome to the program.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight.
Thanks. It's I've heard you on other programs, and you always bring an element of fun to whatever program that you're on. So I've been looking forward to this.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Yes,
you're quite welcome. Your 2009 book, Men of Mystery, Nikola Tesla and Otis T. Carr, Weird Inventions of the Strangest Men Who Ever Lived, is a wee bit of an understatement. Of course, Otis Carr he had patented a flying saucer, and he claimed that he was building a full-size version that could fly to the moon and back in one day.
That's right.
Otis ran afoul of the law and ended up doing time for a securities fraud and was largely discredited. But Tesla is a whole other story. Many make the case that Tesla is probably the most brilliant mind of the 20th century and made a bigger impact on the modern world than Albert Einstein. So, Tim, when did you first get interested in Tesla, and what was it about him that captured your imagination?
Well, Scott, the first time that I ever heard of Nikola Tesla. Now, you have to realize that I grew up and went to school in the late '60s and '70s, and when I went to school, we were always taught that the person who invented electricity, and we'll put that in quotation mark, was Thomas Edison. No mention in any of my textbooks of a guy named Nikola Tesla. So it wasn't until. Yeah, exactly, and and I'm sure there's a lot of other people out there. It was the same way, but it wasn't until probably around 1982, I think. I was working for a television station in Dayton, Ohio, and right close to Dayton is the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And part of one of my jobs was to go with a reporter, once a week, and we would talk with the press liaison there on the base to see if there was any interesting stories that that we could do from there. One day,
like UFOs.
Yeah, no, they're well, we laugh about that, but actually at one time, J. Allen Hynek, the late great UFO investigator, actually gave a speech there on the base because the National Air Force Aeronautics Museum had a little display about Project Blue Book there. So, I mean, we laugh about that, but yeah, actually, there was discussion about UFOs.
Well, it's true. I mean, Wright-Patterson and UFOs are like connected at the hip. So we joke, but serious.
Yeah.
So continue on.
I clearly remember at one point as the base press liaison was going through his files, trying to see if there was anything interesting for us. He said, We've got a couple of projects that we're working on based on, and I remember so clearly, he said that mad scientist Nikola Tesla. He goes, but He goes, right now, we can't really talk about that publicly. And then he went on to something else, and that was all that he said. And that intrigued me. 'Cause first of all, the name, Nikola Tesla. You know, it
Right.
sounds like a name just right out of a science fiction book. And I'd never heard of it before. So I started doing some research, and then it just became a labor of love from that point on, just trying to discover anything that I possibly, could about the guy. And that was my first interest, how I discovered this incredible genius of the 19th, 20th, and well into the 21st century, and maybe even beyond. Who knows?
Yeah. I mean, it's actually an insult to a thinking person's mind to look at the history of contemporary science over the last 100 or so years and leave that man out. And he has been left out for the most part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, more and more, though, fortunately, especially starting since really the turn of the 21st century, I think there has been a lot more attention paid to Tesla. It's taken a while, but you're reading more and more information about him. He's a lot more widely known, and the internet, fortunately, has had a lot to do with that. But really, I mean, before that time, nobody had heard of Tesla, except for geeks like me.
Right. Well, you're in good company, Tim. Honestly. Well,
and I like to think also that my book, The Lost Journals of Nikola Tesla, which came out in late 1999, 2000, had a lot to do with because I've had a lot of people tell me that that was the first book that they read about Tesla that really inspired them to find out more about him. So,
well, there's an interesting backstory on that. Would you like to tell us what that is?
Okay. I'm not quite sure I know what you're referring to.
Oh, didn't you come across a box of papers?
No, it wasn't me. It actually was a book buyer by the name of Dale Alfrey, who lived in I think it was New Jersey. And he was the one who he had bought a bunch of boxes of books from, like a home auction, one of those types of things. And in one of those boxes, underneath books, was a bunch of old paperwork. And once he started looking into it, it turned out to be notes from Tesla. Now, you have to understand that in Tesla's later years, he was not doing very well financially. He basically lived from the benefits of his friends and admirers, who would pay for his room and board and food and stuff like that. All of his patents that he had royalties coming to him had expired. The ones that earlier he should have gotten money for, he actually signed them back over to I think it was the Westinghouse Company, because they needed the money, and since they were the ones who originally backed him for his Niagara Falls project, he felt obligated to help them out. Well, unfortunately, years later, it ended up biting him in the butt, and he was basically destitute. So as he had to move from location to location in New York, a lot of times the hotels that he stayed at would retain his belongings as collateral for whenever he could pay back his bills. So a lot of his stuff ended up getting lost, and ended up, like this situation with the book buyer, just being basically lost and then rediscovered again. And I hear the music coming up there.
Yeah, there's the music. No, that's just astonishing that it does happen, and I've heard similar kinds of stories about other more mundane things like car parts and experimental car parts and such that end up in a box in the back of a shop, and then somebody ends up buying it for a couple of bucks and has something really unusual. So
that's
anyway,
exactly what
you're right, Tim. There's our music. Folks, Tim's books are available at uforeview.tripod.com as well as amazon.com. And Hugo Winterhaller will take us into the commercial break with Canadian Sunset. You're listening to Far Out Radio on the Rents Radio Network. And welcome back to Far Out Radio with Scott Teeters. I'm Scott, and tonight our guest is author and researcher Tim Schwartz, and we're talking about the genius of Nikola Tesla. And that was the theme song from the 1965 James Bond movie Thunderball. And I fully expect that sometime in a future Bond film, 007 will be roaring about or maybe buzzing about in a Tesla Roadster with the optional time travel feature. No, seriously, I mean, you can just see it right there on the screen. 007 pushes the special time travel feature, and he goes back in time about 10 seconds, and now he's behind the bad guy, and then he gets the bad guy. Anyway.
I'd like to see that one myself.
Yeah. Maybe we could all use one of those sometime. You're a little late for work. Yeah, you hit the optional time travel button, and then you leave work early another 10 minutes. So there you go.
There you go.
It could be a very useful thing. So anyway, back to our conversation about Tesla. His accomplishments were just staggering, and his credits were just paltry. Thomas Edison was only 9 years Tesla's senior, yet he managed to get nearly all the glory, all the fame, and the money. Now, the story of their work together and as rivals is truly the stuff of legends, and I'm surprised that there hasn't been a movie made specifically about these two guys. Tim, tell us about their relationship and what made it turn astonishingly sour.
Sure. Well, Tesla was he was born in what's now modern-day Croatia. His parents were Serbian, and he was born in 1856. And he was able to go to the Polytechnic School at Graz, which was at the time a very prestigious university to study engineering, and Tesla studied mechanical and electrical engineering. And it was while he was going to school there at the age of 24, and he was also working part-time for the Central Telephone Exchange, and he got this vision, basically. Most of Tesla's inventions appeared to him as a three-dimensional vision. He said that he could see it right in front of his eyes, just almost like a hologram. And he could mentally take his invention, and he could rotate it. He could take it apart. He could see every aspect of it, and then all he would have to do is just copy this down onto a piece of paper, and have his assistants build it, and most of the time it would work. Well, this was where he discovered what we now know as the induction motor. The parent of our AC currents. Now, at the time in the United States, Edison had the early stages of an electrical system in New York that was based on DC. And while it was innovative for its time, it wasn't very efficient. Edison, it required like maybe every couple of blocks or so a step-up substation to continue the current on down the line. And it just would not have been very effective for, say, cross-country electrical
would have been a mess.
No, yeah, it would have been. Nowadays, there are actually DC, high-voltage DC currents. Don't ask me how they work, but that are very effective and work very much like AC. But at that time, that was all they had. So Tesla always wanted to come to the United States and work with Edison. So he actually got one of his professors to write him a letter of introduction, and he immigrated to the United States specifically to work with Edison. And due to the prestige of this letter of introduction, Edison hired him. And Tesla's first assignment was that he was supposed to rewire a very complex piece of machinery that Edison's engineers had been working on for quite some time and had not been very successful at it. And Edison told Tesla that when he completed it, that he would get a bonus of, I think it was like $20,000 or something like that, and especially if he got it finished in a certain amount of time. Well, Tesla, by himself, managed to get this work done in just a matter of days. That's the kind of genius that Tesla was. And so Tesla went to Edison and say, well, here it is, it's all done, it's working, and working better than it was before. Where's my $20,000? And Edison basically just told Tesla that he wasn't getting his money and that Tesla didn't understand the American sense of humor. So, so Tesla was pretty upset by this and left. And that's really how it started between the two. And then it got even more ferocious a number of years later when Tesla introduced the AC current system that we that we use today, even based on generators that they had built at Niagara Falls to light up the World's Fair in New York. And of course, Edison saw this as a slap in his face, not only personally but in his wallet, because he, this was going to take away Edison's, great DC current venture that he had invested a lot of money into and was expecting a pretty great return. And he saw this all collapsing around him by this young upstart from Europe. And so Edison decided to take on Tesla by playing basically dirty pool.
He certainly did. Tim, there's that music again. We got to roll into our break. This is Jan Hammer's Crockett's theme from the 1980s TV show Miami Vice. For our listeners, you can get Tim's books at Amazon.com as well as UFOview.tripod.com. This is Far Out Radio with Scott Teeters, and we'll be right back. And welcome back to Far Out Radio. That, of course, was Led Zeppelin's Moby Dick, a very popular concert piece for the band, and on more than one occasion, the drummer, John Bonham, would play a solo of the drum portion of that piece for upwards of 30 minutes. And one time he threw his drumsticks out into the audience and played the drums with his hands. Yeah, John was a real live wire, that's for sure. Our guest tonight is Tim Schwartz, and we're talking about Nikola Tesla. We left off with the beginnings of the feud between Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla. And Tim, I think it was in a documentary I saw about Tesla, or no, it was a documentary about Edison that had a little bit of a storyline about Tesla with regard to this PR war that the two were waging. Mostly it was Edison that was waging this war against Tesla in the battle between AC and DC. And there was a line in there, I don't know how correct it was, that Edison was insistent that DC was the way to go because it's DC, as in Washington, D.C. and then they also talked about in this program about Edison that in order to convince the public of the dangers of AC, alternating current, that they put on these stage shows where they would electrocute very large animals, horses, cows, and at one point an elephant.
Yes.
Horrific stuff. Horrific stuff.
Well, and in fact, the first electric chair at New York's Auburn State Prison was put together with the help of Edison, and a criminal by the name of William Kemmler was executed using AC currents. And in fact, the technique was later dubbed Westinghousing, because it was the Westinghouse company that was supporting Tesla and the AC current. Yeah, Edison, he said that the direct current was like a river flowing peacefully to the sea, while alternating current was like a torrent rushing violently over a cliff. So, but, what Edison failed to mention was that DC currents could easily electrocute people as well, because in Manhattan, the wires for Edison's system were strung rather haphazardly, over the sidewalks and the streets, and kids were constantly climbing the poles and touching the wires, and were being electrocuted and killed. So yeah, I mean, it was just a propaganda technique that Edison unsuccessfly, fortunately, weighed against Tesla. But at the time, Edison was the man, and he managed to get a lot of press and publicity over this. But eventually, it came to naught, because the AC current was just a lot more efficient than Edison's DC. So Tesla, eventually won out.
I came across an interesting list today called Tesla's 5 Crazy Inventions. And I'll be brief on this. And the first one was the wireless energy transfer system.
Yep.
The second one was the use of X-rays for diagnostics. The third one was what he called the death ray, which we now would call a particle beam weapon. The fourth one is the earthquake machine. And the fifth one was robotics. And it pointed out that he was the first person to create a remote control device. He built a little RC boat.
Yes. Yep. That's correct. And I should also mention that Nikola Tesla was the inventor of radio. It wasn't Marconi. It was Tesla. Marconi.
Now, how did that get away from him?
Well, it's a pretty complicated story. Once again, see, Tesla was an inventor. He was a man of science, and he really didn't follow up that much on his previous work. Once he was finished with something, he was eager to move on to the next thing. And in fact, when Marconi was doing his radio broadcast experiments, somebody pointed out to Tesla that what Marconi was doing, and Tesla said, "Yes, that guy is using a number of my patents, but that's okay. He's a good guy. Let him do his work." And unfortunately, that's another thing that later turned around and bit Tesla on the butt, because the invention, the credit of radio invention and the patent was awarded to Marconi, even though Tesla had the patent on it a number of years in the past. It wasn't until actually I'm sorry, go ahead.
He needed a manager. He needed a manager is what he needed.
Yes, he did. Very much so.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until after Tesla passed away that the invention, the credit of being an inventor of radio was awarded to Tesla. But a lot of good it did him then.
Right. I think of that little short list I read, I think the most unusual device in that list was his earthquake machine. And it was described as a small oscillating device that he could sort of tune in. It was very small, didn't weigh very much. I think he could hold it in his hands. And the first time that he sort of turned this thing on, started fooling around with it. It set up a frequency that nearly brought the building down. Tell us about that.
Yeah, Tesla discovered what's basically called resonating frequencies. That is that you can actually his little device. Basically, all it did was just produce a series of, say, like taps or knocks onto something. And if you adjust it just right, pretty soon it would find a harmonious frequency with anything, and then that would build up, and you could actually bring a building down. You could create earthquakes with that. Tesla said that with enough time that he could crack the Earth in two with just a slightly larger device. And the handheld device that Tesla came up with, it actually ended up causing a mini earthquake in several blocks around his laboratory, and caused buildings to shake and windows to crash, and people actually thought that there was an earthquake going on.
How about that? What year was that, do you know?
That probably would have been around 1905, something like that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, very early on.
Well, we've got that music going up again. It's the 70s jazz band Diodato. They're going to take us into the break with their rendition of Also Sprach Zarathustra, also known as the theme song to 2001: A Space Odyssey. And Elvis Presley used to use it, too, for his concerts. So, anyway, you're listening to Far Out Radio with Scott Teeters on the Rents Radio Network. We'll be right back. And we are back, and that was El Solo Toro, otherwise known as The Lonely Bull, by Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass from 1962. Anyway, our guest this evening is Tim Schwartz, and we're talking about the genius of Nikola Tesla. And Tesla's life was certainly mysterious. He didn't associate with people. He didn't particularly like people, and the individuals that were able to get a little bit close to him described him as not normal, and some of them called him a real Superman, either a reincarnated master or a spaceman. I mean, this is a very, very strange fellow who led a very strange life, and he had a very strange death. In the next 5 or 8 minutes that we have left, Tim, tell us about his passing and the mystery around what happened to him at the very end.
Sure. Well, Tesla's great dream was the wireless transmission of electricity. And he came up with the idea that you could transmit electricity either through the air or through the ground without the use of wires of any kind. That meant that any house, any building, anywhere could either put up an antenna in the air or shove something down into the ground, and then run their household currents off of something that was being transmitted from a central location. And he even went as far as to get backing and started construction of a facility on Long Island, New York. And really, to this day, nobody is quite sure just exactly how he was going to do this, because most of his material that he based this on has ended up being lost. I mean, we've got some rough ideas, but no one is really quite sure. But Tesla was convinced he knew how to do it, and he was going to do it. He would never have started building this facility unless he was certain it was going to work. Well, unfortunately, his backers discovered about what he was going to do and realized that they probably could not make a profit off of this, so they withdrew their money. And then there was a number of lawsuits and counter lawsuits, and Tesla ended up being broke and destitute, like I had talked about before. And as he grew older, he unfortunately became more eccentric. I mean, he was an eccentric guy to begin with. But, you know, when he was younger, I mean, at least he did socialize. I mean, he liked going to parties. He always dressed well, and he had a number of lady admirers. But as he got older,
he was a good-looking guy.
He was a very good-looking guy, and I mean, there were a number of socialites that would have been very happy to have married him. But, you know, he just was not interested in, you know, I mean, science was his love. And
he got to be a very strange-looking man when he got old.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
really strange-looking.
He probably was not eating as well as he should have.
Right.
And then plus, a couple of years before he died, he had an accident where he was struck by a cab and was injured. And that led to the continuous deterioration of his health. And when he finally did pass away from a heart attack, the United States government very quickly swooped in and confiscated everything of his that they could get their hands onto.
They knew exactly where he was.
Yes. Yeah. And so you have to realize that before he died, I mean, Tesla had made a number of observations to the New York newspapers about certain kinds of inventions, especially, and we talked about this before, the death ray. And he had offered this invention to the United States government, and they refused it. But obviously they were very interested in it and other things that he was doing, because as soon as he died, everything that they could get their hands onto disappeared. And in fact, a number of his paperwork ended up in places like Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where they, continued on with his experiments. I think it was said that they walked away with probably about 2 boxcars full of material that Tesla had at various locations.
2 boxcars?
2 boxcarfuls. It filled an entire warehouse, I was told, and that. But publicly, it was declared that none of this stuff was worth anything. That this guy was a crackpot. That nothing that they had was of any good, and that's where supposedly it ended. But
so it wasn't even worth showing.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, exactly. But all this stuff ended up disappearing, though. Into the black vaults of the government and the military. And
can you imagine the military guys that got to actually get their hands on that and look at it and read it?
Yep. And
wow.
And I mean, to this day, I am positive that we are now just probably catching up to the stuff that Tesla was doing back at the turn of the 19th and 20th century. And we're just now probably starting to grasp what he was conceiving. And that's the unfortunate thing about Tesla, is that a lot of the stuff that he was thinking of in his day, he did not have the science available to him that we have now to make these things possible. I mean, we're talking about things like field propulsion, or anti-gravity, as it's known in science fiction. And Tesla even had his own theory of relativity that he was opposed to Einstein's theory of relativity. Tesla had a completely different idea on how the universe worked. And of course now we're finding that there were a lot of things that Tesla was conceiving was probably right. So instead of being,
I just read today that Tesla at one point was chosen to share a Nobel Prize in physics with Edison.
Yes,
but he refused.
Right.
I can well imagine why, but
yeah. Well, I mean, at that point in his life, he was pretty disgruntled. So I mean, he saw it as basically an empty gesture. So
yeah, but the money would have been nice.
He definitely could have used it, but this was a guy that, I mean, he really had no conception of money. with the except on how he could use it to further fund his research. You know,
it must have come from growing up in a completely different culture. You know.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I mean, so almost like a foreign notion to us.
Yeah. Well, I mean, his father was an Orthodox priest who was very well educated. His mother was a very intelligent woman. In fact, Tesla said that he got his like inventing smarts from his mother. So, but yes, I mean they weren't rich by any means, and Tesla, I mean he was not into hoarding or saving money or becoming rich. He used his money to further his research and to invent stuff. That was his love.
Wow. Tim, we've got about a minute and a half left. As a researcher and a Tesla scholar, what's your most impressive invention of his? I mean, what's your favorite?
Well, I think that as I talked about earlier, the whole wireless transmission of energy is just absolutely fascinating, and I think that. And I'm sure you've heard about it, the HAARP array in Alaska probably is a result of Tesla's ideas on this, because they are using a very similar technology that Tesla conceived. And I've heard, in fact, that in the military there are devices that are available to troops that do just that is able to transmit power to diverse locations without the use of wires of any kind.
Wow.
So, I mean,
that's keeping a good lid on that one.
Yeah, well, yeah, the technology is out there. It's just not available to us.
Wow.
Well, and I would also like to say real quick, Scott, that people can get easy access to my website at www.conspiracyjournal.com.
There you go, folks.
There you go.
Yep. I also noticed that some of your books, maybe all your books, are available at Amazon.com. But for our listeners, if you have a Kindle reader, you can get several of Tim's books in a matter of minutes. You could be reading his books, in the next 5 minutes. So there you go. Tim, you're a very interesting guy, and you've written about some other things that are really eye-popping. The Admiral Byrd stuff is really something. So we'd like to have you back again sometime soon.
Well, I'd be more than happy to. Just name the date, and I'll be there.
Very good. I really appreciate it. So thanks for being with us, and we'll get back to you pretty quick. All righty?
All right. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, Tim. Thanks a lot. Again, we want to remind our listeners that Tim's books are available online at Amazon and conspiracyjournal.com.